Welcome to Chapter 13.13, The Renaissance and the Reformation. In the 1500s, the Renaissance in Northern Europe sparked a religious upheaval that affected Christians at all levels of society. This movement is known as the Protestant Reformation. In the late Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had become caught up in worldly affairs. Popes led lavish lives and hired artists to enhance churches. To finance such projects, the Church increased fees for services. Many Christians protested such acts. They also questioned why the Church in distant Rome should have that kind of power over their lives. In 1517, protests against church abuse turned into a revolt. The German monk named Martin Luther triggered it over an event in Wittenberg, Germany. There, a priest sold indulgences to Christians to raise money to rebuild St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. To Luther, the priest's actions were the final outrage. He wrote 95 theses, or arguments, against these indulgences. He said that they had no biblical basis, and that the Pope did not have the authority to release souls from purgatory, and that Christians should be saved only through faith. Throughout Europe, Luther's 95 Theses stirred furious debate. The new Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, summoned Luther to a diet, or an assembly, at the city of Worms. Luther refused to change his views. Thousands hailed Luther as a hero and renounced the authority of the Pope. At the heart of Luther's doctrine were several beliefs, including the idea that all Christians have equal access to God through faith and the Bible. The printing press spread Luther's writings and ideas throughout Germany and Scandinavia, and by 1530, Luther's many followers were using a new name, Protestants, for those who protested against the papal authority. In Switzerland, the reformer John Calvin also challenged the Catholic Church. Calvin shared many of Luther's beliefs, but also preached predestination. Protestants in Geneva asked Calvin to lead them. In keeping with his teachings, Calvin set up a theocracy. Reformers from all over Europe visited Geneva and then returned home and spread Calvin's ideas. These new challenges to the Roman Church set off fierce wars of religion across Europe. In the 1600s, English Calvinists sailed to America to escape the persecution. All right, there were 7 things that the Catholic Church was corrupting the Catholic Church. Number 1 was simony. Simony is the sale of church offices. For example, in 1487, the Pope sold 24 offices to individuals who would then use that position to raise taxes in that area and repay themselves the bribe that they had given to the Pope in return for the position. So it was a little bit complicated, but simony is basically the sale of church offices by the Pope or by a higher official. The reformers were really angry about this, and because it wasn't, so people who gained a position in the church, it was not because of their qualifications, but because of their willingness to pay a bribe. And so you got the lower end of the moral spectrum there of people in positions of power. Number 2 was pluralism, which is basically when one official holds more than one office. And this was bad because people didn't get the services that they needed, like all the sacraments that the church required for salvation wouldn't be administered. Number 3 was absenteeism, where officials didn't even live in the territories that they were supposed to be officiating in. So the officials often would live in Rome or in nice cities rather than in the countryside where they were supposed to be working. Number 4 was sale of indulgences. They would sell people documents saying that the church absolved them of their sins or sins of their loved ones, and this was especially done by a man named John Tetzel, who we will talk about later. There was also something called nepotism, which basically means that family members of church officials were favored by giving those family members positions underneath or in other areas of the church. So there are two examples of this. Both Leo X and Clement VII were sons of the Medici rulers. So they were both Florentine Medici men who had no real interest in being pope other than the power that they gained from that position. And both of them were notorious for their womanizing and their debauchery. Paul III also had two of his own grandsons become cardinals. And popes shouldn't be having children at all. So this was just really showed the decline of the papacy. The next one was the moral decline of the papacy. So that was its own abuse. One of the most notorious popes of all was Pope Alexander VI. He was the one that had so many children out of wedlock, and 20% of all the priests were keeping concubines during the 1600s, or the 1500s, excuse me. The final thing is clerical ignorance. Many priests were virtually illiterate. They couldn't read Latin, and so they were teaching things that were completely made up. It was a terrible situation in the church. The church was becoming increasingly involved in world politics. The popes were competing with the Italian princes for political power. They fought wars to try to protect the papal states. They plotted against powerful monarchs who sought to control papal lands. And they lived in luxury, supporting the arts and hiring artists to beautify their churches. To support their lavish lifestyle, these church officials had to charge fees for their services, such as baptism and marriage. This is another reason why indulgences began to be sold during this time. The Christian humanists in the Northern Renaissance called for reform in the church. Many of the Christian humanists began to read the Bible for themselves and saw clearly that the church was not following the biblical model for a church. There were several specific critics who stand out in the 1300s and 1400s. One of the first ones was a man named John Wycliffe, who lived from 1329 to 1384. And he was probably one of the earlier reformers of during this time period. And he was a professor in England at Oxford, and he was kind of a foreshadowing of Martin Luther's views that came along in the 1500s. Wycliffe stressed a personal relationship with God, or a personal communion with God. And he actually felt that the sacraments that the church claimed to bring salvation were not that important. Wycliffe translated one of the earliest versions of the English Bible, but because of the lack of ability to reproduce the Bible at that point, there was no printing press yet. The dissemination of the Bible was very limited, and however, he did have a lot of followers, and his followers were named Lollards, who continued to spread his ideas on into the 1500s. Another reformer was named John Huss, and he lived in what is modern-day Czech Republic. He probably spoke German. He lived from 1369 to 1415. And his ideas were very similar to Wycliffe's. In fact, John Huss probably read some of Wycliffe's writings and agreed with him or had his mind changed by Wycliffe. John Huss was an academic dean at the University of Prague, but when he challenged the church's teachings, he was accused of being a heretic, and though he was given safe conduct to his trial, he was not allowed to return, and instead he was burnt at the stake. But it was Martin Luther who brought the Reformation to fruition, basically. Martin Luther was originally an Augustinian monk, and he was a professor at the University of Wittenberg in Saxony, which is in modern-day Germany. He had a close encounter with some lightning and apparently was very frightened of death. And it got him thinking about his own salvation. And as he continues to question the church's teachings, he began to study the Bible for himself. The view of God that he had before his conversion was a God who was angry and wrathful and out to get him, basically. But as he studied the Bible, he came to know or understand that God was a God of grace and mercy, and he also discovered that it is by faith that a person is saved. It's not by good works. So when a man named John Tetzel came to town, he was a Catholic indulgence seller. He was a priest who sold indulgences to help raise money for the church. He was authorized by Pope Leo X, who was one of those Medici men who had been put into the position of Pope. And the Medici Leo X was trying to raise funds to build his cathedral in Rome, or in the Vatican. These indulgences were payments that would reduce a person's punishment in purgatory. You could also reduce the pain or punishment of a loved one who had already died. John Tetzel had a quote that he liked to use. He said, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs." And he was probably one of the biggest money raisers of that time period. Luther criticized the selling of these indulgences, but he went further than most people before him by questioning the spiritual authority of the Pope to grant indulgences. Whether Luther actually nailed his 95 Theses to the Wittenberg church door, or he just sent them to the resident bishop, it's a matter of historical dispute. But the printing press really facilitated the spread of Luther's work, so that the whole of Europe soon knew of his ideas and his, quote, heresy. Initially, the Pope viewed the issue of the 95 Theses as basically an insignificant disagreement between two different sects of Christianity, or two different houses of monks. But theological debates among the clergy members was not unprecedented. But in 1518, Luther defied the Pope by refusing to stop his crusade. He was protected by a man named Frederick III, who was the elector of Saxony, or the prince of that region. And at this point, Luther did not really want to break away from the Catholic Church, but he just wanted to reform it so that it would be more like what the Bible talked about. Luther was called to a debate by a man named John Eck, who was one of the great Catholic theologians of the time period, and they were to meet at Leipzig in 1519. At this debate, Luther denied both the infallibility of the Pope and the infallibility of the General Council, which was the main decision-making body of the Catholic Church. Luther claimed that the Church had erred when it executed John Huss for heresy. This was the point of no return for Luther. In 1520, Luther published his Theology of Reform in 3 separate works, and these were the things that he taught. His first teaching was that Scripture alone was the basis of faith, not the church teaching or the church fathers. Although they were helpful in understanding the Bible alone was the true basis for what the church should be guided by. The second thing is that our salvation is through Christ alone. We can't be saved by works or by following the 7 sacraments. It is Christ alone that is the author of our salvation. Thirdly, it is by grace alone. We cannot try to earn our way to salvation. It has to be because of Christ's grace. Fourthly, it is faith in God alone that will cause our salvation. And fifthly, it's all of our goal and our job is to glorify God, not to try to glorify other things. Because Luther believed that the Bible was the sole authority for Christian life, he kind of rejected the 7 sacraments and narrowed it down to 2 that he felt were the only essential and biblical sacraments that the church could offer. First one was, that the church could offer as being essential. The first one was baptism, and the second was communion. Luther rejected the idea of transubstantiation. This idea was that when the Mass was given for communion, and the wine and the bread of the Eucharist were prayed for, there was a special transformation that happened in creating the wine as the actual blood of Christ and the bread as the actual body of Christ. Luther rejected that idea, but instead supported the idea of consubstantiation, which means that the real presence of God in the bread and the wine are there. Luther also claimed that there was a priesthood of all believers, that the hierarchical structure that the Catholic Church had created was not biblical, and that Christians should not be subjected to the Pope's interpretation of the Bible, but that the Bible contained all that was needed for a person to lead a Christian life, and that the church hierarchy with bishops and priests and such was really unnecessary. When Luther received a papal bull stating that he should recant his teachings and humbly accept the discipline of the church, he simply threw the papal bull into the fire, and it was the beginning of his journey towards excommunication by Pope Leo X. Charles V had promised before he was elected as the Holy Roman Emperor that he would not allow anyone in his empire to be excommunicated without a fair trial. Charles demanded that Luther recant his writings in the Diet of Worms in 1521. But Luther refused. His statement was, "Unless I am convinced by the testimony of the Holy Scriptures and by evidence of reason, I can believe neither Pope nor the Council alone, as it is clear that they have erred repeatedly and contradicted themselves. I consider myself convicted by the testimony of the Holy Scriptures, which is my basis. My conscience is captive to the Word of God. Thus I cannot and will not recant, because acting against one's conscience is neither safe nor sound. God help me. Amen." And so in the Edict of Worms, Luther was outlawed as a heretic by the Holy Roman Emperor. When he was on his way back to his hometown, Luther was kidnapped by some agents from Frederick III, who was his benefactor, and taken to a castle where he was protected, and he continued to write in secret. In 1523, Luther translated the Bible into the vernacular, profoundly influencing the development of the modern German language. And many German states in the north turned to Lutheranism. Many German princes were politically motivated in their turning from Catholicism to Lutheranism, because they could now escape the authority of the Catholic Church, and they confiscated church lands for their own benefit. The southern part of Germany largely remained Catholic, but Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and northern Germany became Lutheran states. Lutheranism did not spread much beyond northern Germany and Scandinavia, however. And unlike Calvinism, that spread throughout Western Europe and parts of the New World. It was during this time, in 1525, when peasants began demanding an end to serfdom and tithes, and other practices of feudalism that oppressed the peasantry, like hunting rights, etc. And many of these peasants were inspired by Luther's claims, and ironically, Luther's views on the peasants' revolt were quite negative. Luther advocated for religious reforms because God's realm was not a worldly one, but he believed that people should continue to obey their political leaders. Luther may have sympathized with some of the complaints from the peasants, but he was disgusted by the violence of the peasant movement. He asked the German princes to violently stamp out the revolt, and through the carnage, about 100,000 peasants died during this uprising. There were both Catholic and Lutheran forces that took part in this revolt. The Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, was really like a medieval emperor in that he was trying to maintain the religious unity of Europe. He allied himself with the Pope and tried to stamp out the heresy that was beginning in Germany. The Protestant states gained support from different other European countries, and including, surprisingly, France, which was Catholic but enjoyed seeing Germany divided, and so would support whichever side was losing in order to continue the conflict. This conflict played an important role in the long-term political fragmentation of Germany. In fact, Germany did not unite until the 1800s. But Charles finally had to leave the idea of a unified Catholic Germany and unified Catholic Europe, and by the 1550s he was forced to give up on restoring all the German states into the Holy Roman Empire. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 temporarily ended the struggle in Germany over Lutheranism. Basically, the princes in Germany could choose either Protestantism or Catholicism. Protestants living in Catholic states were allowed to move to Catholic states, and the same was true for Catholics living in Protestant states. But the result was permanent religious division in Germany. Essentially, basically, the division stunted German nationalism, and Germany wasn't actually unified as a state until 1871. Reformers in Switzerland also challenged the authority of the Catholic Church. The first group were the Anabaptists, who were formed in 1525 in Zurich, Switzerland. This group of individuals were a voluntary group of believers who rejected secular agreements with between anyone and refused to take civil oaths or pay taxes or hold public office or serve in the military. So basically they wanted to have nothing to do with civil service or civil government. They did not believe in childhood baptisms, and only adults could make a decision to commit to Christ, they felt, and so adults would be baptized. They were also a little bit odd in their beliefs about the end of the world coming, and that it was coming within the next year or so, and so they lived as if life was coming to an end with that amount of extremism. They rejected the idea of the Trinity, and some historians see the Anabaptists as kind of a left-wing Protestant Reformation. There are still groups that found their origins within the Anabaptists. Three come to mind. The first are the Mennonites. They were founded by a Dutch leader named Menno Simons, who was a descendant of Anabaptists, and he emphasized pacifism, which is basically not taking part in government violence, so no wars or anything like that. The second group would be the Quakers, which were founded in England, and they shared similar beliefs, and thousands of Quakers came to America, where they founded the colony of Pennsylvania, and also settled in New Jersey and Delaware. And the third group were the Unitarians, who reject the Trinity also. And you'll find Unitarians around today. There's even a Unitarian church in downtown Honolulu, but they are much more about social Christianity rather than heartfelt or internalizing Christianity. Ulrich Zwingli was another Swiss reformer who rose up during this time. He lived from 1484 to 1531, and he was a student of humanism who preached from Erasmus's edition of the New Testament Greek translation. Zwingli adopted Luther's ideas about religious beliefs, and then he also tried to create a theocracy in Zurich. But in contrast to Luther, he saw the Eucharist as only symbolic, whereas Luther viewed the Eucharist as the real presence of the body and blood of Christ. So, in fact, Luther felt so strongly against Zwingli that they never were friends during this time. This became one of the first disputes between Protestants. And just as the Protestants broke away from the Catholic Church, within the first few years of the new Protestant Reformation, many different breaks started to happen. So this is where we get our idea of denominations. Another reformer was a man named Calvin, John Calvin, who lived from 1509 to 1564, and he was probably one of the most significant Protestant theologians and reformers. John Calvin was a Frenchman who studied to be a priest and later trained to be a lawyer. He was greatly influenced by humanism, especially Erasmus. And when he started to have differing views from that of the Catholic Church, he had to run away from France to Switzerland, which was outside of French or Holy Roman Emperor control. And while he was there, he was asked to help govern the city-state of Geneva. He is known to have written quite a few different books on theology, but one of his most influential books was titled Institutes of the Christian Religion. One of his foundational ideas was the idea of predestination. And predestination is the thought that since God is all-knowing, he already knows who's going to go to heaven and who's going to go to hell. And so it is God, who draws man to himself. It is not man who chooses to follow God. Or maybe it is, but the point is that God is the all-powerful mover in the relationship between man and God. Calvin said that good works are not enough for salvation because there is no free will since God has already made his decision. But good works are a sign of those who have been chosen for salvation. So God reveals if one has been chosen or for salvation by a conversion experience. The elect, or those who are chosen, are church members who have had their conversion experience, and they should become model Christians. Calvin established something called a theocracy, which is supposedly a state that is ruled by God. This was the city-state of Geneva, and by 1540, Geneva had become the new center of the Reformation in Europe. Geneva became the home to Protestants in exile from England and Scotland and France, and these men would later return to their own countries having learned their theology from Calvin. And so many of the churches that are formed in the rest of the world are actually descendants of that first Calvinist movement. So, for example, the Presbyterian Church is founded by John Knox in Scotland, was greatly influenced by Calvin.